hash, just hanging out, talking, doing this off the top of my head with no script. I'm not panicking! Hi BookTube, I am here with my February wrap-up. The majority of my reading this month was for Canada Reads, and I'll be releasing individual reviews for each of those books, but I will talk about them a bit on here. And I did manage to read a few other things that weren't Canada Reads as well, so it was a good reading month for me. I'm going to talk about the audiobooks first. I read How the World Thinks by Julian Baggini on audio. This is a global history of philosophy, and it was really interesting. You know, he made the point in the beginning saying how when we study philosophy in the Western world, even at the university level, it tends to concentrate on Western philosophy. So he went about this book explaining his own learning process of learning about more Eastern philosophy or other philosophies that aren't discussed as much. So he concentrated mostly on Asian philosophy, Indian philosophy, mostly Hindu philosophy in regards to that. He also talked a lot about Japanese, Chinese, and Korean history, and then he touched a bit on African and Australian Aboriginal philosophy as well. So it was really interesting to learn these different ways of thinking and how much philosophy affects our day-to-day life, and how it's important to understand philosophy when interacting with other cultures because they have different ways of looking at things. So, for example, if you're talking to someone from India about important issues, they may have a completely different view on it because of the philosophy that's ingrained in the culture. And he mentions also that you don't have to be aware that it's philosophy, you don't have to be aware of the exact philosophy, because it becomes so ingrained in our culture and our society that we don't even realize that the philosophy is affecting how we think. So it was really interesting to kind of be taken out of, you know, my Canadian philosophy into experiencing the philosophy of other people and, you know, learning more about their cultures that way. Another audiobook I listened to is We Are Legion, We Are... Oh, I don't have the author. In a momento. Hey Google, who wrote We Are Legion, We Are Bob?
Dennis E. Taylor wrote We Are Legion, We Are Bob.
So, another audiobook that I listened to was We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor, and this was a really interesting science fiction novel. It's about a man who has his consciousness transferred into a computer, which is then set off to explore the universe. And he does that by creating clones of himself, and what that means is like computer clones. He doesn't actually have a physical body, aside from the ship that he's traveling in. You know, he is the ship because he's the computer that's running it. So he builds other ships with other computer versions of himself. And it was a really interesting look at, you know, identity and, you know, what happens if we split ourselves into so many pieces. You know, is a clone going to be exactly the same as you are? Are you, you know, if you're in a computer, are you a different person from who you were if you were in a physical body? Are you the same person who you were when you were younger? It's a really interesting look at that. And it also helped me discover a new genre that I love, which is like kind of like first contact observations of like early humanesque creatures. I also really liked the politics that he brought up in regards to like how the world would change in, you know, like 100 years times. Yeah, it was a really good book overall. I also listened to the second Murderbot novel called Artificial Condition by Martha Wells, and I just really enjoy reading about Murderbot and how you know, sentient robots view humanity. And this was a really interesting take on that, as our Murderbot tries to pass for human and continues on their journey started in the first novel. What is interesting though is that this was narrated by a male narrator, and when I read the first book in physical format, I pictured a female voice. So that was interesting. I also reread the second book in the Wheel of Time series called The Great Hunt. As I said, this is a reread for me. I already love this series. I also love some of the characters that we get introduced into here, such as Celine, which develops into a further interesting character. And we begin to really see the effects of what is happening to the main characters from Emmons Field. I can't say too much because it's the second book. And I also forgot that the Songshan get introduced so early on. I thought that happened later on in the series, but it happens in book 2. And they're an interesting culture. And then I read the Canada Reads books. So We Have Always Been Here by Samra Habib is subtitled A Queer Muslim Memoir. And it's a memoir of Samra Habib, obviously, who grew up in Pakistan in a minority sect called the Ahmadi Muslims, who were persecuted by the government. She became a refugee in Canada with her family as a young girl, and then kind of discovered herself through a variety of ways, and eventually came to understand herself as a queer Muslim. And it was such a readable book, and I really enjoyed seeing that perspective that we don't often see of not only religious queer people, but also a brown voice as well. Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club by Megan Gale Coles was an interesting book. I have a complicated relationship with it. I would have loved this book if it was probably 200 pages shorter. It just felt, because of how relentless Megan Gale Coles was, I feel like it actually became overly long, suffocating, and repetitive at points. So that's what kind of turned me off from it. This is the story of a group of, young millennials, mostly working class people, living in Newfoundland, and the whole slew of issues that they deal with, mostly concentrating on sexism and sexual assault, abusive relationships, and toxic masculinity. And as I said, I would have really enjoyed this book if it had been a little shorter. And then there's Radicalized by Cory Doctorow, which is actually not a cohesive novel, but is in fact 4 novellas or long short stories. And I really enjoyed this. I'd say this was one of my favorite books of this month. Each of the stories is science fiction based, even though it's not too heavy on the science fiction. And each of them addresses social justice issues and the complexity of social justice issues as well. So it's not just very straightforward. He's talking about like intersectionality and, maybe what we're trying to do to help these issues is not always very helpful. And I really liked the nuanced views that he brought to that. Son of a Trickster was another book for Canada Reads that I read by Eden Robinson. This is a fictional story of a young Métis boy. He's actually 16. So whether you consider that young or not, I guess depends on your own age. He's young to me. And he's, dealing with rough family dynamics. His father left him when he was younger, and he's actually supporting his father. His mother is an addict and very violent. And, through all of this, he is dealing with his own issues of drug and alcohol abuse, but he's also such a very compassionate and tender person that I found myself, absolutely loving to read about him. And I really found the book enjoyable. It's actually a trilogy. And one of my issues about it was that the last quarter kind of felt like the last quarter felt really different from the first part of the book. But I can understand that maybe in the context of the trilogy it will make more sense. So I look forward to continuing with the trilogy to kind of see if it becomes more cohesive there. And lastly is From the Ashes by Jessie Thistle, which is another memoir. And I actually had problems with previous memoirs on Canada Reads, but this year these memoirs are excellent. And I really enjoyed, I enjoyed reading them, and I enjoyed the experience of reading them, but it's also tough to say that because they deal with a lot of tough issues. So From the Ashes deals with homelessness and addiction in a very brutal and graphic manner. So Jessie Thistle is a Métis, again, and he was also abandoned completely by both his father and his mother as a toddler, and gets raised by his very clueless grandparents and falls into addiction and homelessness. And it is very readable. but also very graphic. So the words on the page just have you reading and reading and reading, but then he like smacks you in the face sometimes with like dirtiness, like just things that, you know, make you cringe, but are also like real things that he experienced and important things to read about. So yeah, I say I enjoy it, but it was also very intense, and not a good kind of enjoyment, if that makes sense. So those are the books I read in February. That's actually 9 books read this month, which is astounding. I had a great time reading this month, and nothing is really super disappointed. So let me know which books you read this month, and if you read any of these and your thoughts on them, and thank you for watching.